Thank you so much. My name is Shoshana Hershkowitz. I am the statewide organizer for education and childcare at Citizen Action of New York. I have the pleasure and privilege of working with the Long Island Advocacy Center as well as Families Together New York State. I spend a lot of time on Zoom with Brad, who you saw earlier. And we're working really hard to pass the Solutions Not Suspensions bill, which has been in the New York State Legislature for 7 years, has not yet had a vote. And I want to tell you why this bill is so important. You've heard so much of this already from our previous speakers, but even before COVID, kids were losing time in their schools due to exclusionary discipline. We now have a real, just escalated crisis because of the loss of time for every kid. And they're coming back to schools with gaps not only in academic learning, but in social and emotional issues. And I can say this, I'm not only an organizer and advocate, I'm a parent, I'm also an educator. I've been teaching for 24 years. The first 10 years were spent in K through 12 in public education in Suffolk County. And I was a dean of discipline, so I am all too familiar with what exclusionary discipline looks like and how it is enacted in our schools. Our kids cannot afford to lose any more time from school. They cannot afford to be excluded and isolated any longer. We're seeing it play out in their mental health. We're seeing it play out in their test scores. And that is where this bill can come in handy. The Solutions Not Suspensions bill, the nuts and bolts of it are as follows. Eliminating suspensions for grades K through 3, our youngest learners, because we have 5 to 8-year-olds that are being suspended. And I want to point out, as a parent of young children, when a child that age is suspended, it is the parent who is staying home with them and losing time. And I want to be quite frank, it is usually the mother. And we know that workforces right now are struggling to get women back in the workplace. They are at the lowest rates since 1998 because of a lack of adequate childcare. So, we can applaud that. So when we put a child who's 5 to 8 years old at home, we're also sending the parent home from the workforce. And when we talk about our older learners, and I've talked about this with legislators at length, many of them say, well, 5 to 8 years old, absolutely, we shouldn't suspend them. But when we look at secondary age students, and this is where it gets really troubling, they're probably home alone. And when you talk about a child who is struggling with mental health and academic issues, at home alone for a prolonged amount of time without adequate instruction and resources, that is a tragedy waiting to happen. And that is what the Solutions Not Suspensions bill is aiming to avoid. We want to eliminate suspensions for grades K through 3. We want to implement restorative practices in the schools. You heard so beautifully and eloquently from Dr. Jones what that looks like in the Patchogue-Medford School District. And here's the thing, that is only one of 700 school districts in New York State. 125 of them here on Long Island. A child shouldn't be, just by chance or by zip code, fortunate enough to come across a Dr. Jones in their life and a group of educators that have been given the training that she is giving her staff. We want that across New York State. We want to have those types of resources, not only for kids, but for teachers. Because I can tell you in a classroom, when you come across a child who is struggling, if you don't know how to deal with it, if you don't have those resources, if you don't have that training, you may not be able to give those kids what they need and deserve. So that is what this bill is after. We want to make sure that we are getting rid of suspensions for grades K through 3, and that at the older levels, we're not, if we have to suspend them, which should be a last resort. It should be an absolute last resort after every other option has been exhausted. But if we have to suspend them, right now they can be suspended for up to an entire school year, 180 days. Yeah, that is a tremendous loss of learning, of community, of resources. We don't want them, if they have to be suspended, they should not be suspended for longer than 20 days. That's already a month of school. So we are asking that our legislators bring this bill to the floor for a vote and pass it, because it is just the beginning. Because the truth is, suspensions are what happens in a chain of events. We're looking also to mandate restorative practices and the resources that are needed within the schools. And the truth is we have foundation aid. We have the ability to get this done. What we need is the political will and the moral courage of legislators to make that happen and to give teachers and school districts and superintendents the resources and support they need and deserve to serve every child, because every child has a right to be in school. And I'll conclude with just a story from my teaching days. I now teach older children, I guess they're still adults, but 18-year-olds are still kids, we all know that. I teach at the collegiate level now, but when I taught high school, I spent the last few years as a dean of discipline. And when I followed the code of conduct, I'll tell you the story of one young man who came into the dean's office for smoking on campus. And I was told, well, in the code of conduct, you give this kid a detention for smoking. And I thought to myself, that doesn't really address the nicotine addiction. But I had to follow the code of conduct, and I gave the student a detention. And guess what? They didn't come to that detention. And in the code of conduct, the next step was to give them 2 more detentions. You see where this is going. And then, guess what? The student didn't come to those detentions either. So I had to give them an in-school suspension. So now, this child has lost a day of learning, and we've never addressed the root cause. And what I want to point out to you is that this was in a fairly well-to-do school district. The problems get significantly worse by the statistics when you look at students of color, when you look at students with disabilities, when you look at LGBTQ students. And a recent report from NICLU said, the greatest indicator of whether a student will be suspended will not be what they did, it will be the color of their skin and whether they were suspended before. So this is an issue. It is, when we think about parents having to stay home, it's an economic issue and as a gender issue because it's usually the mother. When we look at this from just an educational issue, it is an equity issue, and it is also a racial justice issue. And I think that we have seen across this country there is a reckoning to be had in our relationship with race, and that is also true in our schools. So part of how we address this is passing solutions, not suspensions, in 2023 in the New York State Legislature, and then giving teachers and administrators the resources to create across Long Island's 125 school districts and New York State's 700 school districts the type of restorative practices. And Dr. Jones called it out-of-the-box thinking. I think it's time for a new box, quite honestly. This is legislation that is common sense, that serves the needs of children and gives educators and administrators in the school system the resources it deserves to educate every child, no matter what they look like, where they come from, how they learn, how they worship, or who they love. Thank you.